For decades, humans had dreamed of joining the stars. They built rockets, satellites, and finally achieved faster-than-light travel in the year 2187. The day Earth's first FTL ship broke through the light barrier. People celebrated around the world. They thought they were special. They thought they were pioneers. They were wrong. The universe was already full, not just with life, but with advanced civilizations that looked at humans the way humans might look at ants building a tiny hill. When Admiral Jack Wilson led Earth's first official contact mission aboard the ESS Discovery, he expected awe, respect, or at least professional courtesy. Instead, he got laughter. "You mean you just discovered dimensional folding?" The alien diplomat, a tall blue-skinned being called Ambassador Krell, didn't even try to hide his amusement. Most species figure that out before they master fire. Wilson's face turned red, but he kept his composure. Earth is eager to learn and join the galactic community. Krell made a sound like stones in a blender, apparently his species' version of a chuckle. Of course. We welcome all developing species." That first meeting set the pattern for all that followed. Earth joined the Galactic Union as a Class 8 civilization, only 2 steps above pre-industrial societies. Humans were allowed to trade, but only for basic goods. They could travel, but only with permits. They could speak at union meetings, but nobody listened. Back on Earth, most people didn't know the truth. The government kept it simple. "We found aliens. They're friendly. We're working together." But Admiral Wilson knew better. Every time he sat in those giant meeting halls, surrounded by beings that could reshape matter with their minds or live for thousands of years, he felt the weight of humanity's weakness. "They're laughing at us," he told Dr. Anna Reed one night after a particularly difficult union meeting. They sat in her small lab at the Mars research base, sharing a bottle of whiskey Wilson had smuggled from Earth. Reed was different from other scientists. While most researchers focused on copying alien technology, she looked for new paths. Her lab was filled with strange equipment that didn't make sense to anyone but her. "Let them laugh," she said, eyes focused on a swirling holographic display. "While they're busy laughing, we'll be working." Wilson took another drink. "Working on what? We're centuries behind them." Reed smiled and turned off the display. "They think in straight lines, Jack. They found the 5th dimension for travel, then the 6th for energy. They think the pattern will continue, that the 7th dimension will just be more of the same. And you think differently. I know differently." She pulled out a small device from her desk drawer. It looked simple, just a metal cube with a strange, shifting pattern on its surface. "They're all fighting over the same resources, the same planets, the same energy. But the 7th dimension isn't about any of that." Wilson leaned forward. "What is it about?" "Rules," Reed said. "The fundamental rules of reality itself." She set the cube on the table between them. "I've touched it, Jack. Just for a second. The computer models show I'm right." "Show you're right about what?" Wilson asked, suddenly feeling uneasy. Reed's eyes reflected the cube's shifting patterns. "That humanity doesn't need to catch up to them. We can skip ahead." She lowered her voice. "I need funding, a ship, and a crew willing to take risks. Can you make that happen?" Wilson stared at the cube, then back at Reed's determined face. He thought about all the mocking laughter, all the dismissive looks, all the times Earth's people had been treated like children. "Yes," he said finally. "I can make that happen." They didn't know it yet, but that night in a small lab on Mars, the era of galactic laughter had begun its countdown to extinction. 6 months after their meeting on Mars, Admiral Wilson stood in a hidden underground facility beneath the Arizona desert. The space was vast, filled with equipment that looked cobbled together from both human and alien tech. At the center stood Dr. Reed's creation, a prototype device that resembled a metal sphere with countless shifting patterns across its surface. "You're sure this place is secure?" Wilson asked, watching technicians scurry around the device. Completely off the grid, Reed replied. The Galactic Union thinks this is a waste processing facility. Their sensors can't penetrate our shielding. Wilson nodded. Good. Tell me what I'm looking at. Reed led him closer to the sphere. Most species understand reality as having 4 dimensions, 3 of space, 1 of time. The advanced races discovered the 5th dimension, which allows them to bend space for faster than light travel. And the 6th? Wilson asked. Energy manipulation. The ability to create or transform matter. Reed pointed to the sphere, but they all hit a wall at the 7th dimension. They think it's just theoretical, impossible to access. Wilson raised an eyebrow. But you found a way. I found the door, Reed corrected. Now we need to open it. Later that day, Wilson sat with Reed in the facility's small conference room. On the screen before them were images of 5 people, 3 women and 2 men. These are your pilots? Wilson asked. Reed nodded. The best. They all scored off the charts on dimensional thinking tests. They know the risks. They know we don't fully understand the risks, Reed said honestly, but they're willing. The first 3 tests went badly. The pilots entered the small prototype vessel, attempted to breach the dimensional barrier, and simply disappeared. No explosion, no debris, just gone. After each failure, Reed worked day and night, adjusting calculations, tweaking the equipment. On the day of the 4th test, Wilson arrived to find the facility in an unusual state. The normal buzz of activity was replaced by tense silence. Technicians moved carefully, speaking in whispers. What's going on? Wilson asked Reed when he found her staring at her screens. Tom Miller goes in today, she said without looking up. He's our last qualified pilot. Wilson watched the man on the screen. Average height, brown hair, calm eyes. Nothing special to look at, but something about him felt different. What makes you think today will be different? Wilson asked. Reed finally looked up. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. Because I'm going with my gut instead of the math. The previous pilots followed the calculated path. Today, I'm telling Miller to feel his way through. Wilson frowned. That doesn't sound very scientific. The 7th dimension isn't about science as we understand it, Reed said. It's about perception. The test began. Miller entered the small vessel, a sphere-shaped craft barely big enough for 1 person. The countdown started. Unlike previous tests, there was no dramatic light show, no energy readings spiking off the charts. The sphere simply shifted. It became hard to look at directly, as if it existed and didn't exist at the same time. Then it vanished. 3 hours later, when hope had nearly faded, alarms blared. The sphere reappeared exactly where it had been, but changed. Its surface now moved like liquid metal, patterns flowing across it that hurt the eyes if viewed too long. When they opened the hatch, Miller sat inside, unharmed but transformed. His eyes reflected the same impossible patterns as the ship's hull. Did you see it? Reed asked eagerly. Did you reach the 7th dimension? Miller looked at her with those strange eyes and smiled. I didn't just see it, he said quietly. I touched it. And it touched me back. He handed Reed a small device he built while inside. Here's how we build the real thing. Wilson looked at Reed, whose face shone with vindication and wonder. How long? He asked. 1 year, she replied. 1 year to build a ship that will change everything. The construction of humanity's secret weapon happened in plain sight. Admiral Wilson secured funding for what he publicly called Earth's next-generation defense vessel. When alien representatives asked questions, he smiled and told them it was just Earth trying to catch up to basic galactic standards. How cute, Ambassador Krell had said during his inspection tour of the massive shipyard in Earth orbit. You're building a Class 6 shield system. My species developed those about 5,000 years ago. Wilson had nodded politely. We're learning as fast as we can. What the aliens didn't know was that the visible parts of the ship were just a shell. The true heart of the vessel was being built in sections, deep underground on the dark side of the moon. The project was officially named UNSS Prometheus, after the figure from human mythology who stole fire from the gods to give to mankind. The name was Wilson's idea. This time, he had told Reed, "We're stealing something much more powerful than fire." Tom Miller became essential to the project. After his journey into the seventh dimension, he was changed. He could see patterns no one else could see, understand concepts that made no sense to other humans. Under his guidance, engineers built systems that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "How does this even work?" asked Chief Engineer Davis one day, staring at a blueprint Miller had drawn. Miller's strange eyes, still reflecting impossible patterns, looked distant. "It doesn't work in our dimensions. It works in the seventh. We're just building the framework here." The construction took exactly 1 year. During that time, Earth's position in the galaxy grew even more precarious. "They're taking us for granted," Wilson told Reed as they reviewed reports in the Lunar Base's command center. 3 more planets in our solar system have been claimed by different alien factions for resource assessment. Jupiter, Neptune, and now Venus, Reed said, looking at the data. "They don't even ask anymore. They just inform us after they've set up operations." Wilson's fist clenched. "They think we can't stop them." "When will Prometheus be ready?" "Final systems check tomorrow," Reed replied. "Miller says we need to run 1 more test before full activation." The test was scheduled for 400 hours. Wilson, Reed, and a small team of top engineers gathered in the Lunar Command Center. On the main screen, they watched as Prometheus, looking like an ordinary, if large, spaceship, moved into position near Earth's moon. Beginning 7th dimensional interface test, Miller's voice came through the comms. He was the only person aboard the vessel. No one else could safely navigate what was about to happen. Reed leaned toward the microphone. "Remember, Tom, just a glimpse. Don't fully engage." "Understood." The room fell silent as Miller activated the ship's core system, what they called the dimensional aperture engine. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then the sensors started showing impossible readings. "What's happening?" Wilson asked, looking at screens that were displaying numbers and symbols that made no sense. Reed's eyes were wide. "He's doing it. He's opening a doorway to the 7th dimension." On the main screen, Prometheus seemed to blur. Parts of it appeared to be in multiple places at once. Light bent around it in ways that shouldn't be possible. Then, for just 3 seconds, the ship simply ceased to exist before snapping back into normal space. Alarms blared through the command center. Tom, do you copy?" Reed called urgently. For 10 long seconds, there was nothing. Then Miller's voice came through, sounding distant and strange. "I'm here. Test successful. The engine works exactly as designed." Wilson let out the breath he'd been holding. "Any problems?" "No problems," Miller replied. "But there is something you should know." "What's that?" Reed asked. "We were noticed," Miller said softly. "When I opened the doorway, something on the other side looked back." Reed and Wilson exchanged worried glances. "Is that dangerous?" Wilson asked. "Not to us," Miller said. "But when Prometheus fully activates, the universe is going to change. The rules are going to change." His voice had an odd note of both warning and wonder. "We won't be the joke anymore." Wilson nodded grimly. "Good. It's time to move to the final phase." The message arrived without warning. All communication devices on Earth simultaneously displayed the same image: a massive fleet of warships, their sleek black hulls adorned with red symbols that looked like claw marks. "People of Earth," the alien commander's voice boomed. His face filled screens worldwide. Gray skin, 6 yellow eyes arranged in a circle, and teeth like polished metal. "I am Supreme War Leader Drez of the Arcturus hegemony. Your planet has been selected for resource extraction. In the emergency bunker beneath Washington, D.C., world leaders gathered in panic. Admiral Wilson sat silently, watching the message continue. You will surrender all mining rights to your system's asteroids, moons, and outer planets, Dres continued. Additionally, you will provide 10,000 human workers annually for our labor colonies. The alien smiled, showing those metallic teeth. This is a generous offer. Most species at your development level are simply... He made a crushing gesture with his hand. When the transmission ended, chaos erupted in the bunker. They can't do this, the European president shouted. What choice do we have? Asked another leader. Their fleet could destroy us in minutes. Admiral Wilson stood up. The room quieted as he walked to the center table. I have been authorized to reveal that Earth has a response option, he said calmly. What kind of option? The Chinese premier asked skeptically. Your new ship, the one that's still untested. Wilson shook his head. Prometheus is fully operational. It's been ready for 3 weeks. One ship against their fleet? Someone scoffed. Wilson looked around the room. I need unanimous approval to deploy our response. I cannot explain exactly what Prometheus can do, but I promise you this. After today, no alien civilization will ever threaten Earth again. The debate raged for hours. Finally, with reluctant agreement from all nations, Wilson received his authorization. He immediately contacted Dr. Reed, who was aboard Prometheus with the skeleton crew. We're a go, Wilson told her. Is Miller ready? Reed's face on the screen looked tense. He's been ready since the Arcturus fleet arrived. He says he knew they were coming. How could he know that? Reed shook her head. He says the 7th dimension doesn't experience time the way we do. He sees things. Wilson frowned but pushed aside his concerns. The Arcturus have given us 48 hours to respond. I'm sending you the coordinates for a meeting I've arranged. Reed raised an eyebrow. A meeting? I offered to demonstrate our surrender technology to their war leader. He found the idea amusing enough to agree. 24 hours later, Wilson stood on the bridge of a small diplomatic vessel halfway between Earth and the massive Arcturus fleet. Beside him stood military leaders from 4 Earth nations, all looking nervous. On the main view screen, War Leader Dres sat on what appeared to be a throne made of twisted metal. I find this meeting puzzling, Dres said, his 6 eyes blinking in sequence, but entertaining. You wish to show us your surrender. We already know what that looks like. Wilson stood straight. Not our surrender. Our response. Dres laughed, a sound like metal grinding. Response. Your species has no meaningful response to offer. Your most powerful weapons would barely scratch our smallest ships. Perhaps you'd like to see our new vessel, Wilson suggested calmly. Dres waved a hand dismissively. Very well. Show me this impressive Earth technology. The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. Wilson nodded to his communications officer. Prometheus, you are clear to approach. The Arcturus sensors must have detected Prometheus then, because Dres's officers began speaking rapidly in their language. On a secondary screen, Wilson could see the Prometheus appearing from behind Earth's moon, looking like an ordinary, if large, human vessel. This. Dres laughed loudly. This is your response. One ship. His laughter grew, and soon his entire bridge crew joined in. The sound of alien mockery filled the communication channel. Wilson didn't respond. He simply opened a private channel to Prometheus. Tom, he said quietly, show them what humanity can do. On the screen, Miller nodded. His strange, pattern-filled eyes seemed to glow. Beginning dimensional shift, he replied. Tell everyone to keep watching. The laughter from the Arcturus command ship suddenly stopped. Something strange happened to the video feed. The image of the Prometheus seemed to blur, then sharpen, then blur again. The Arcturus technicians frantically adjusted their equipment, but the problem wasn't with the transmission. It was with reality itself. What trick is this? War Leader Dres demanded, his 6 yellow eyes narrowing. Your primitive visual effects do not impress us." Admiral Wilson said nothing. He simply watched as the Prometheus began its transformation. At first, the change was subtle. The ship's hull began to shimmer, like heat rising from hot pavement. Then the effect intensified. Parts of the vessel seemed to exist in multiple places at once, creating a ghost-like image that hurt the eyes to look at directly. "Sensor report." Dres barked at his crew. An Arcturus officer responded, panic evident in his voice. "Unknown readings, war leader. The human vessel is everywhere and nowhere at once." On Wilson's diplomatic vessel, the Earth military leaders watched in awe. None of them had been told what Prometheus could really do. They had expected weapons, perhaps some reverse-engineered alien technology. Not this. "Admiral," one whispered, "what is happening?" "Dimensional shift," Wilson replied quietly. Phase 1. On the main screen, Dres stood up from his throne, his confidence visibly shaken. "Human, explain this phenomenon immediately." Wilson allowed himself a small smile. "War Leader Dres, you're witnessing humanity's contribution to galactic science. We call it seventh-dimensional engineering." "Impossible," one of Dres's scientists shouted. "The seventh dimension is theoretical only. No species has." The scientist's words cut off as the Prometheus completed its transformation. The ship no longer resembled anything human-made. It had become something else, a structure that seemed to fold in on itself endlessly, creating patterns that made no logical sense. It shimmered with colors that had no names in any human or alien language. In that moment, every alarm on the Arcturus command ship began to sound at once. "Energy spike," shouted an officer. "Unknown type." "Shields at maximum," ordered Dres. "Shields not responding," came the panicked reply. Wilson opened his channel to the Prometheus again. "Tom, remember, this is a demonstration only. Show restraint." "Understood," Miller's voice replied, though it sounded different now, as if multiple versions of him were speaking at once. "Initiating localized dimensional bubble, 3-second duration." What happened next defied explanation in normal space. A sphere of distorted reality expanded from the Prometheus, about 100 meters in diameter. It didn't move toward the Arcturus fleet. It simply existed. And within that sphere, the laws of physics changed. 3 small Arcturus scout ships had the misfortune of being within that bubble. They didn't explode. They didn't break apart. They simply collapsed, folding in on themselves like paper sculptures being crushed by an invisible hand. In less than 3 seconds, they had compressed into objects no larger than pebbles, which then winked out of existence entirely. The bubble disappeared. The Prometheus returned to its strange, pattern-shifting state, hovering silently in space. Complete silence filled the communication channel. On the screen, War Leader Dres stood frozen, all 6 eyes wide with shock. Behind him, his crew sat motionless at their stations. Finally, Dres spoke, his voice barely a whisper. What did you do?" Wilson kept his voice level, though inside he felt a mixture of awe and terror at what he had just witnessed. "We temporarily altered the compression ratio of space-time within that small area. The effect is localized and controllable." "This is not possible," Dres said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And yet you saw it happen," Wilson replied. "The Prometheus can create effects far more dramatic than that small demonstration. It can expand the bubble to encompass your entire fleet, if necessary." For the first time in recorded history, an Arcturus war leader visibly trembled. "What do you want?" Wilson straightened his uniform. "The complete withdrawal of Arcturus forces from Earth space, a formal recognition of Earth's sovereignty over our entire solar system, and a renegotiation of humanity's status in the Galactic Union." Dres stared silently for several long moments. The legendary Arcturus pride warred visibly with fear on his alien face. "You will have it," he finally said. As the communication ended, one of Earth's generals turned to Wilson. "My God, Admiral, what have we created?" Wilson watched the Prometheus on the view screen, still shifting in and out of comprehensible reality. "Our future," he answered simply. News of the encounter spread through the galaxy faster than light itself. Within days, ships from every major civilization appeared at the edge of Earth's solar system. Not warships, but diplomatic vessels, observation crafts, and science ships. They kept their distance, watching, scanning, trying to understand what humanity had unleashed. On board the Prometheus, Tom Miller floated in the ship's central chamber. The room no longer resembled anything human-made. Its walls shifted and flowed, covered with the same strange patterns that swirled in Miller's eyes. He didn't need control panels anymore. He simply thought, and the ship responded. Dr. Reed entered the chamber, moving carefully through the shifting gravity. "Tom, how are you feeling?" Miller turned slowly. When he spoke, his voice had a strange echo, as if multiple versions of him were speaking at once. "I am. More than I was. Less than I will be." Reed frowned. Ever since the demonstration, Miller had grown more distant, speaking in riddles. "The Admiral wants to know if you can control it." "The full power, I mean." "Controlled is the wrong word," Miller replied. "The seventh dimension isn't something you control. It's something you dance with. But you won't let it go too far. You won't let it change you completely." Miller's strange eyes focused on her, suddenly sharp and clear. "I'm still me, Anna. I'm still human. Just more." Meanwhile, aboard the diplomatic station hastily constructed at Earth's L4 point, Admiral Wilson faced the largest gathering of alien representatives in human history. Species that had never bothered to visit Earth before now clamored for meetings. "You must understand," said the representative from the Centauri Alliance, a being that looked like a tall, thin praying mantis. "This technology cannot be allowed to spread. It is too dangerous." "Too dangerous for whom?" Wilson asked calmly. "For everyone," exclaimed Ambassador Krell. The blue-skinned alien who had once laughed at humanity now looked shaken. "What your ship did defies the natural order. It breaks the fundamental rules of reality." Wilson spread his hands. "Rules your people wrote. Rules that kept humanity at the bottom." The chamber fell silent. A new voice spoke, deep and resonant. It belonged to an ancient being known as the Elder, representative of the oldest known species in the galaxy. Its body was a swirl of golden light contained within a crystalline shell. "We did not make the rules to keep you down," the Elder said, its voice somehow sad. "We made them to keep everyone safe. There is a reason no species has fully breached the seventh dimension before." Wilson leaned forward. "And what reason is that?" "Because it notices," the Elder replied. "The seventh dimension is not empty. It is aware." Back on the Prometheus, Miller suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened, and the pattern swirling across the walls of the chamber intensified. "Tom, what's wrong?" Reed asked, alarmed. "They're coming," he whispered. "Who's coming?" "The Watchers, the ones who live in the seventh dimension. I felt them when we first tested the ship. Now they're coming to see us properly." Reed's face paled. "Is that bad?" Miller's expression was unreadable. "It's neither good nor bad. It just is. They're curious about us." The ship's alarms suddenly activated. Outside the Prometheus, space itself began to warp and bend. The stars shifted position, light twisted, and gravity fluctuated wildly. In the diplomatic station, the alien representatives fell into panic as their sensors detected the disturbance. "What have you done?" the Elder demanded, its crystalline shell pulsing with golden light. "Nothing," Wilson replied honestly. "This isn't us." A massive view screen showed the area near the Prometheus. Reality itself seemed to fold open like a book, revealing something else. Not darkness, not light, but a space between spaces, filled with shifting, living patterns that mirrored those on the Prometheus's hull. Through this impossible opening came objects, or perhaps beings, that defied description. They existed in more dimensions than the eye could process, appearing as constantly changing geometric forms that hurt the mind to look at directly. The Watchers, the elder whispered in awe. They have never shown themselves before. The strange entities surrounded the Prometheus. There was no communication that anyone could detect, no exchange of signals or information. But Miller, inside the ship, understood. He spoke, his voice now carrying easily to both the ship and the diplomatic station, as if distance had become meaningless. They recognize us, he said. For the first time, a species has reached toward them instead of just using their dimension as a tool. They want to know us. The elder's crystalline shell trembled. And what do they offer in return for this knowing? Miller's voice came back, filled with wonder. Everything. 3 months after the appearance of the Watchers, Earth had transformed. Not physically. The planet still looked the same from space, blue and green and beautiful. But its place in the galaxy had changed forever. In the Great Hall of the newly built Dimensional Embassy in Geneva, Admiral Wilson stood before representatives from over 200 alien civilizations. The room was designed to accommodate beings of all shapes, sizes, and environmental needs. Some floated in special tanks, others hovered in anti-gravity fields, and a few existed as projections of pure energy. The treaties are now complete, Wilson announced. Earth thanks you all for your cooperation in establishing the new dimensional accords. None of the aliens laughed now. None looked down on the humans speaking to them. Instead, they listened with complete attention, some even showing signs of what might be called reverence. Ambassador Krell, once so dismissive of humans, now served as Wilson's assistant. He stepped forward, his blue skin shimmering under the lights. The first provision, Krell announced, establishes Earth as a protected neutral zone for dimensional research. No military vessels from any civilization may approach within 1 light-year of the Sol system without explicit permission. Wilson nodded and continued. The second provision creates the Dimensional Council, with representatives from all willing species. This council will oversee the careful, controlled sharing of seventh dimensional knowledge. In her laboratory beneath the embassy, Dr. Reed worked alongside scientists from a dozen different worlds. The room was filled with equipment both alien and human, all focused on studying small, controlled openings to the seventh dimension. The patterns are stabilizing, Reed told her colleagues, pointing to a display showing swirling, impossible geometries. We can now maintain a micro-opening for up to 17 minutes. An insect-like alien scientist clicked its mandibles excitedly. This could revolutionize medicine across the galaxy. Diseases could be eliminated by temporarily altering the fundamental rules of biology. Carefully, Reed cautioned. Always carefully. We've all agreed. Baby steps only. Miles away, in a specially constructed facility in the Swiss Alps, Tom Miller lived in peaceful isolation. His quarters were unique. The walls, floor, and ceiling constantly shifted and changed, mirroring the patterns in his eyes. He rarely spoke to anyone except Reed and Wilson, but when he did, his insights were profound. Today, Wilson had come to visit him, climbing the mountain path to Miller's sanctuary. The Watchers have been quiet, Wilson said as they sat together on a balcony overlooking the mountains. Have they spoken to you recently? Miller smiled. His eyes still swirled with those strange patterns, but his face remained humankind. They don't speak as we understand it. They share, and yes, they continue to share. What do they share? Wilson asked, not for the first time. Perspective, Miller replied. They exist across all possible realities at once. They see every path, every possibility. He turned to look at Wilson. They're not gods, Jack. They're just very, very old and very, very wise. And they approve of what we're doing. The treaties, the controlled research. Miller nodded. They appreciate caution. Time means nothing to them. They're happy to wait while we learn slowly. In orbit above Earth, the Prometheus remained, now permanently transformed. It no longer resembled a ship at all, but a structure that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially elsewhere. No one could board it anymore except Miller. It had become a beacon, a doorway, and a warning all at once. Back in Geneva, the meeting concluded. As the alien representatives filed out, the Elder approached Wilson. Its crystalline shell glowed softly in the room's light. "You have surprised us all," the Elder said. "When your species gained access to the seventh dimension, we feared you would use it as a weapon. Instead, you have chosen to make it a bridge." Wilson shrugged slightly. "We were tired of being laughed at, but we didn't want to become the bullies." "Perhaps that is why the Watchers chose you," the Elder suggested. "Of all the species who have reached for the higher dimensions, you were the first to do so, not for power, but for understanding." "And what happens now?" Wilson asked. The Elder's light pulsed gently. "Now we all learn together. The galaxy laughed at humanity once. Today, the galaxy learns from humanity." As Wilson left the building, he looked up at the night sky. Somewhere up there, the Prometheus hung in orbit, a constant reminder that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined. And humanity, once the cosmic joke, had become the species that changed the rules of reality itself. Not with violence, not with conquest, but with a simple, human desire to understand.